On today's Locked On Jayhawks, biggest strengths, biggest questions for KU as we're about 4 weeks away from the season and the latest that has been said so far at fall camp for KU.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and you can find our show. It's called Locked On Jayhawks, anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. Thank you to the everydayers tuning in each and every show. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. On today's episode, we're talking biggest strengths, biggest questions for KU football in 2024 as we're about 4 weeks out from the opening game. And with being 27 days away, we're going to get into some of the latest that has been said by coaches at press conferences as fall camp has officially started for KU earlier this week. So we'll round that up with some of the latest info that you need to know. Let's start with the strengths. We'll work ourselves into the questions and then get to some of the latest of what's going on. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, so what are some of the biggest strengths for KU football ahead of preseason camp? I think the number one biggest strength that I kind of think about, or I don't know, maybe not number one, I don't know that I'm ordering these, is coaching. Because in general, having Lance Leipold, one of the best coaches in the conference in the entire country, having, coaching staff that was put together by Lance Leipold that you really trust. You feel like Kansas is a very good or very well-coached football team, right? There's a reason that they've had this turnaround and gotten to where they are. And so you almost have trust in that, right? To a certain point to where it's like, okay, you trust that this coaching staff is going to get the most out of this team. You trust that this coaching staff is going to put this team in the right positions consistently, right? And obviously there are a lot of new assistant coaches this year, more than had to come in the previous season, but there still are a lot of bright minds that are around there that you feel like that is going to be a plus for KU. And in a lot of the games you're going to go up against, you're going to have the better coach. And I think a lot of times, you can boil down, obviously it doesn't always end up this way, but a lot of times you pick the best combination of coach and quarterback, you're going to wind up with the correct team winning that game. It doesn't always end up being the case because there are other things that matter in football, but those are probably the two most important. Chiefs have Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. That works out pretty well, right? Lance Leipold's one of the best coaches in the country. Jalen Daniels is one of the best quarterbacks in the country, right? That is one of the best duos of those two in the entire country. So that is one of the biggest strengths. Running the damn ball. That is a big strength for KU football this upcoming season, right? You have a loaded running back room. Devin Neal, who is going to be an All-American candidate, all Big 12 candidate. Daniel Highshaw, who if Devin Neal would have gone pro early last season, I mean, maybe Daniel Highshaw's popping up on, I don't know, some of these talks about, maybe he's like Phil Steele, third team all preseason Big 12 or something like that. I don't know. He's shown a lot in the past previously. So you feel good about where he's at. Savion Morrison, former highly recruited guy. We haven't had to see it a ton on the field, but we have seen some flashes of it on the field where it looks pretty good and explosive. And then Harry Stewart seems to be getting rave reviews so far. Even Johnny Thompson, who redshirted last year, sounds like he's shown some good things so far. So you have a really good running back room. You have a quarterback who can run the football in the case of Jalen Daniels. Cole Ballard's kind of a moxie runner, right? He's a tough runner, but he can run a little bit. We saw that a little bit. Isaiah Marshall can run the ball. That goes back to his high school days. So like you have running quarterbacks. You have receivers who are willing to and really take pride in blocking down the field. You have a good slew of tight ends, and you've got a good offensive line. This team should be good running the football. They were good running the football 2 seasons ago. They were even better running the football a season ago. And last season, if you look at college football graphs, stats of war, they were 7th in the country in rushing efficiency, basically, meaning they were one of the most efficient rushing teams in the entire country, right? We know if you're comparing total yardage, if you're looking at total rushing yards per game, They might not be as high as some other teams because Kansas played at a slower tempo season ago, and they were a balanced offense, right? You have some teams who might run triple option, and they're going to, of course, average more rushing yards per game, but which one is more efficient? And Kansas was one of the most efficient running teams in the country last year. That should continue and carry over into this year. Offensive explosivity, I think, is something that feels like a strength for KU. Now, maybe this one's not as big of a known commodity as these other two that I mentioned because of the fact that you have a new coordinator in there with Jeff Grimes, to where Andy Kotelnicki was so good at finding those explosive plays. Now, it wasn't just Kotelnicki, though. It was the players, right? It was guys blocking up those big holes to allow a running back to take off. Devin Neal making a couple great cuts that allow that explosive play. Jalen Daniels or Jason Bean throwing a beautiful deep ball. One of the receivers making a unbelievable contested catch downfield. Like, to a certain standpoint, as good as Andy Kotelnicki was to help them get those explosive plays, the players made a lot of those explosive plays, and you still do have them. But yeah, like, how does having Jeff Grimes affect that, in terms of some of the play calling? Certainly when he was at Baylor, like maybe more receiver screens than you were doing now, but they did take some vertical shots downfield with Baylor. So that was something that Kansas was so good at last season. They were 29th in the country in plays of 10 or more yards. They were 17th in the nation in plays of 20 or more yards offensively. They were tied 10th nationally in plays of 30 or more yards, 7th in plays of 40 or more yards. They were 12th in plays of 50 or more yards, and they were 33rd in plays of 70 or more yards. So regardless of kind of which yard line you're looking at there, like, this was a very explosive offense, and you have like the band back together, so to speak, with all these guys coming back, that you should continue to be a very explosive offense this season, which you have to have that explosivity, right? It's great if you can grind down the field and continue to have long drives and exercise those and score on those long drives, but that's not sustainable over a full game, right? It's great that you can do that, and you do need to be able to do that. But over a long game, if you have to grind it out every single drive, eventually you might have a turnover. Eventually you might have a penalty. Eventually, like, something might happen that holds it against you, where you need those explosive plays to kind of take the seal off once or twice a game. Playmaking secondary is another big strength that you feel certain about coming into this season. So this goes beyond the corners. I feel good about the playmaking ability of OJ Burrows, who can get some interceptions this year. Marvin Grant's a playmaker in terms of being a good run defender and a pass defender. We saw growth in that area of his game a season ago. Obviously, though, this is led by the corners, Kobe Bryant and Melo Dotson. Both those guys are not just really good corners, but they are playmaking corners, whether it's providing a big hit. The Kobe Bryant one against BYU, right, where it forces the fumble and he takes it back for a touchdown. Getting a interception, getting a pick six like Melo Dotson, had in the game against Oklahoma, right? Playmaking secondaries can be so impactful in a game and turning the momentum and bringing you momentum, as it kind of did in both of those games, kind of setting the right tone in both of those situations that I mentioned with BYU and Oklahoma. You feel good about that is one of the big strengths for KU, that they should be able to take the ball away and get it back for the offense. What are some of the biggest questions for KU headed into the season? We'll get to that and the latest going on in preseason camp on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. We are brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and experience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, continuing on with Locked On Jayhawks, and thank you to the Everydayers tuning in each and every show. Don't forget you can check out all across the conference, another school, another sport, all along our Locked On podcast network. So what are the biggest questions for KU football headed into this season? I mean, number one, you've heard it a time or two before, and you're going to continue to hear it a time or two again once we get to the season, ahead of the season, in the season. What is the health of Jalen Daniels going to be? That's the big storyline. That's the big question for KU football. That completely changes the arc and trajectory of this season. Are you just a bowl team or that has another good year showing sustained growth as a program under Lance Leipold? Or are you a team that can win double-digit games, can make it to the Big 12 title, can win the Big 12 title, go to the college football playoff? Those upper-end scenarios rely on Jalen Daniels being healthy, unless, for all we know, Cole Ballard is going to take this Jason Bean level leap, or Isaiah Marshall is going to be like that good right off the bat, whoever the backup ends up being. But yeah, that is the big question here. What is the health of Jalen Daniels? Unfortunately, not really an answer. I mean, right now we can point to and say that everything looks good so far in camp, but last year, it just kind of came out of the blue, right? He's playing great for a couple weeks and then it happens. And it's an unfortunate thing that happens. Like, I don't hold it against Jalen in any way. He's not choosing this. It's just something that is a reality of this all, and you have to kind of deal with. Okay, the other big question is pass rush. Now, this is something that Brian Borland actually, we'll get to some of these comments in our next segment of the show, but seemed pretty pleased with some of the athleticism there at that defensive end spot. But certainly the experience or on paper pass rush leaves a little bit to be desired. Now, Jeremy Robinson, Dylan Woodkey, they have production at a Division I level, Woodkey at the FCS level, of getting sacks. It's not to a degree of 8 to 10 sacks per game, but it's to a degree that you feel like, okay, each of them could pitch in 3, 4, 5 sacks this season for KU. The question is that other defensive end spot, which is more of the pass rushing defensive end spot, the one that was departed by Austin Booker. You also lost Hayden Hatcher there too, right? So you have a lot of very talented guys in there. There's no doubt that you're going to get future production from that defensive end room, right? You have Bai Jobe and Dean Miller and Dak Brinkley and Deshaun Warner. We'll see what the health status is of like Dylan Brooks. But the question is, what are you going to get right now? Because this is the year that you're trying to compete for a Big 12 title, right? And next year, with all the seniors you could be losing, I don't know, maybe next year you're more so competing to just make it to another bowl game, right? And I don't know, it's all dependent on the transfer portal and everything. And we don't need to get ahead of ourselves. Enjoy the moment you're in right now. Point being, are you going to get enough pass rush? Because you feel good about the DBs. I feel good about the linebackers. I think the defensive tackles I feel good about. That's kind of the one missing piece to where if that kind of lives up to where it was last year, the defense should be like sizably better than it was a season ago, when it already made a big jump from the year before that, which made another jump from the year before that. Run defense, I think, is a big question here. And this is something that Brian Borland, again, kind of harped on in his meeting with the media after, I think it was Thursday's camp, or maybe it was Wednesday's, I can't remember. So they were better last season against the run than they were in 2022. 2022, they gave up 209 rushing yards per game on 4.8 yards per carry. 2023, like I said, they were better, 162 yards per game. So, that's almost 50 yards better from the year before. 4.4 yards per carry, almost a half a yard better. Those are nice jumps for the deep. It really is in what they did against the run. But even that said, even with the big jumps you made, even with the strides you made in run defense, both of those still ranked outside the top 80 nationally. So you went from being one of the worst run defenses in the country in 2022 to being a below average run defense in the country in 2023. Again, give credit. That's a nice jump to have, and you hope that the arrow stays up, and it kind of has to. And like I said, Brian Borland kind of recently mentioned that third down defense and red zone defense, like those are the keys to really improving for that KU defense. But if you do improve the run defense, I think that goes back in line with helping answer the previous question we just talked about, the pass rush. If you're in 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9, 3rd and 10 more often than you are in 3rd and 3, 3rd and 4, you can kind of pin your ears back if you're the defensive end. You can kind of throw a pass rush blitz at the opposing quarterback. You can get creative with some of the stuff you're doing, because if it's 3rd and 3, they could run, they could pass, right? You kind of have to like, if you're defensive end, you can't overrun it, right? You got to maintain lane integrity, but that might hurt your pass rush. So I think that would certainly help in both areas there. The last big question here is special teams for me. So you lose Seth Keller, who it felt like kind of a limp to the finish line with how the kicking was going, but still at the end of the day, he only missed 2 field goals on the season. Obviously there were some of the blocked PAT issues, but it feels like right now there's maybe a question for the competition of that kicker position. I think Damon Greaves was last in the Big 12 in yards per punt, though if you look at like the net yards per punt, it was more toward the middle of the pack in the Big 12, so at least that was better because he was able to get it up high in the air. Obviously, we saw KU's special teams in the first half of the season was actually pretty good. You had the Trevor Wilson punt return for a touchdown, but over the back half of the season, too many mistakes. The muffed punts, the muffed kick against Oklahoma, obviously the muffed punt against Kansas State. What is the special teams going to do? can you get it to a point where, like, special teams is not one of those things where it's like, hey, you were the 100th best offense in the country last year. Chances are you're probably not going to be the 10th best offense in the country next season. Like, that doesn't happen in college football. We see teams get a lot better, but we don't see that type of turnaround. Special teams, you could go from being like the 90th best special teams to being the 20th best. Like, there's just a little differences there. So that becomes the question for me. How much better can that get into trying to boost to add another win or two and make it to the Big 12 title? All right, let's talk about some of the pertinent things that have been said or shared from preseason camp so far for KU football on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. We are brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games. And sports aren't sports like you want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood, which has been a lot of fun during the Summer Olympics. They do have that stuff on there. You can get futures on the NFL or college football. You want to bet Kansas over 8.5 wins or to make the college football playoff at 6-1 odds. Of course, you can get futures on any sport that are not going on right now. We got preseason football getting started. If you're a total, like football lover, I guess if you want to get into that, not my cup of tea to bet on preseason football, but there's still so many other sports going on. MLB, Bobby Witt's killing it. And this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. Thanks for joining us here on Locked On Jayhawks. Again, you can find our show anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. Thank you to the Everydayers tuning in to each and every show. And don't forget, you can check out all sorts of great content all across the Locked On Podcast Network. So we're 27 days away. How about that from the Kansas Lindenwood game, which means we're officially less than 4 weeks away. That 27 sounds a lot. Like when we were in the 30s even, that still kind of sounded like, that's kind of far away. 27 is starting to feel really real for me. Maybe it's because camp has started, which I guess yearly diatribe. Why is it called fall camp? It's not the fall. It's like 100 degrees out. It's dead in the summer. Anyway, regardless, fall camp, preseason camp, whatever you want to call it. Here's some of the more interesting quotes that have been gathered so far that I wanted to at least quickly touch on here between some of the coaches that met with the media throughout the week. So Lance Leipold talked about Daryl Simmons, who is the transfer guard from Iowa State. He said, quote, he seems more comfortable. He seems understanding. His body's better. That becomes interesting because it feels like that guard position. I mean, if you're going to assume, and we're going to get into another quote here that maybe takes away this assumption, but if you're going to assume Logan Brown at left tackle, you got Bryce Foster at center, Michael Ford at left guard, and Bryce Cable at right tackle, that leaves the right guard spot open. Okay, Kobe Baines would be a good candidate for that. Nolan Garchika could be a candidate for that. Daryl Simmons would be a candidate for that. So that certainly sounds good for Daryl Simmons. But it's not just about who is going to be that other starter, because we saw last year, Kansas basically gave 6 offensive linemen starter-level snaps because you had Kobe Baines and Armaj Reed Adams, in this case, who were basically playing starter level snaps. So could that be Daryl Simmons this year kind of playing that role? Lance Leipold on Caleb Taylor. He's become a very respected leader in a very quiet way. He adds that so much of that is Taylor's total buy-in. Early on, he was brought in on his terms, but now it's complete buy-in. And he is somebody as Caleb Taylor, and that was from Matt Tate, by the way, of R1S1 Sports. That was something with Taylor where, he played probably a little earlier than you would have liked, 2-3 years ago, something like that, just in terms of typically with linemen, you want to get their bodies right before they have to play at the Big 12 level. But Kansas was thin on defensive linemen and defensive tackles, and he was playing a little. I think he talked about this last year. I think he was playing at like 270 or something like that, which is tough to do in the Big 12. But more power to him because he actually had a pretty good year I forget if that was the 2021 or 2022 season. And that kind of got me thinking like he was going to have a breakout season that next year. Didn't really end up happening. And then, he kind of fell out of favor in the rotation a little bit, wasn't playing as much. And then kind of midway through last year, I forget if it was when there were some injuries on the defensive line or what caused it to happen. But I want to say it was like the Iowa State game, started to rotate in a little bit more and started to show some flashes again. And you started to see the guy that was exciting about. And as the season went on, he just seemingly got better and better. And I think he talked about, again, in regard to the weight, like his issue was that he would you would burn the calories, you would lose the weight as the season went on, right? Because you're working out, you're going to practice, you're playing these games, and that's part of the thing. Like you hear all the time, oh, this player showed up at 320 to camp. Okay, but by the time the season starts, he might be 300. There isn't just mastery in knowing how to get your weight up to the proper weight that Matt Gildersleeve and the coaching staff wants you to play at. It's maintaining that weight over the course of the season when you're working out all the time and finding the right diet and finding the right amount of, protein shakes you got to, have and all that sort of stuff to maintain that weight. And he kind of figured that out last year. So I would not be surprised if Caleb Taylor ends up having that breakout season this year in a very real way. Like, would it shock me if Caleb Taylor started next to DJ Withers? No, not at all. Okay, this is Jeff Grimes on Bryce Foster. He said he already caught up well with terminology and needs to prove to teammates he's the number one guy. I think that makes sense. You're just basically challenging a guy who, like, I'm sure the coaches behind closed doors are like, yeah, Bryce is going to be our starter, but they're not going to straight up tell him that because they want him to earn it, right? And at the same point in time, like, even if they're assuming he's going to be the starter, they really do believe in you have to earn your repetition. So, like, if he did fall on his face, then yeah, he wouldn't win the job. But this was interesting though on Grimes. He said he could potentially play guard and that Shane Bumgarner has had a good summer. Now, this would be a good problem to have. If all your offensive linemen are playing so well that you're like, I don't know who to start where. All right, if Shane Bumgarner is, because it sounds like he had a big adjustment in the spring, which makes some sense. But if Shane Bumgarner, it's like, man, we're just trying to put our 5 best offensive linemen on the field, and he's one of those. And so we have to move Bryce Foster to guard. Like, that's a good problem to have. That's a good problem to have if you have a guy that earned his spot because he's playing that well. And now the depth of your team is just that much better. So I found that very interesting. I do think that was maybe more motivated to trying to make sure Bryce Foster, stays working hard and that Shane Bumgarner feels like he has a real shot at this and just keep working hard and stuff like that. So I would still expect Bryce Foster to be the starter, but I think that's a very good sign between Bumgarner and Simmons about what they could kind of bring to the table there. Brian Borland, meanwhile, said that he likes the defensive end group and that they're more athletic and longer than they've been with good competition there. That makes sense. I think the ceiling, the potential, the athleticism, the length, those things are better in this defensive end group than they have been in any year, mostly because those guys you have such high ceilings. But how do you get them to play closer to that ceiling? How do you raise their floor? How do you get them knowing what they're doing in all the right way? It's going to very much be on the coaching staff. If those position groups have, I think Taiwo Onotolu, very underrated what he has done for KU when you look at that defensive end position. And so if he can do it again, work your magic, man, because sky's the limit with the talent in that group. The last one I wanted to mention here was Brian Borland mentioned that the Hawk position has been filled by guys from the safety spot. So Marvin Grant, the Dye brothers, which would be Jalen and Devin, and then they even used Dre Gibson, who is one of the incoming freshman corners from Desert Edge, in the Cinco so they have different versions of it. The Hawk and the Cinco are basically the same spot. It's kind of that like nickelback, linebacker, third safety type role. But in the Cinco role, it's for more of a true DB because I don't know if the Cinco relates to because it's the nickel defense, right? That's what you do when you're in a more of a passing situation versus the Hawk is more of that Craig Young. Craig Young basically played all of it for KU because he was such a freak athlete. But the Hawk is more of the the Cinco is more of like a true DB. The Hawk is like a DB linebacker hybrid. And then they also said that when they're playing maybe more 2 tight end sets, so basically heavier sets, you use another linebacker in there, which would be Jason Gilliam or Alex Reich, which were a couple of the names mentioned. And those guys are both, even though they're linebackers, they're kind of like between linebackers and Hawks. So you're kind of like this spectrum. You have like all the way DB would be Dre Gibson if it's passing down. Then finding its way to Hawk in the middle could be Marvin Grant. You use a third safety with one of the Dye brothers or Mason Ellis, who got talked up a little bit, or Taylor Davis or something like that. Or one of the Dye brothers is at Hawk and you have Grant and Burrows as your normal safeties. And then you go to the heavier set where you have, Gilliam or Reich as the other linebacker. But both guys that have played that Hawk a little bit that you still feel like you have some of that coverage in there. So I like that for KU. And that's kind of the beauty of that is that you do have that ability to kind of mix and match. And I just think about, the Moneyball quote where it's like, well, we can't recreate or we we don't have Jason Giambi anymore. We just have to recreate him in the aggregate. Like that's what they're doing with Craig Young. They're like, we don't have Craig Young anymore. We're just going to recreate him in the aggregate, right? It'll be this guy here. It'll be this guy there. And I think that's sound strategy because I think KU has the players to do it. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. Thank you to everydayers tuning in to each and every show. We will be back for you on Monday, barring any breaking news over the weekend. We're going to talk some of the biggest camp battles for KU football, and we're going to start getting into our position previews with the quarterback room. So you're not going to want to miss that in addition to all the other content we have coming at you throughout the week. We're getting close to KU football season. See you Monday on Locked On Jayhawks.